Julia Serano, in this chapter of her book, Whipping Girl, talks about her experience in mostly women-dominated spaces. And she points out that the anti-discrimination that trans women generally come across, not only in women-only spaces, but there and in the rest of society, is largely rooted in traditional sexism. So trans women are systematically sensationalized, sexualized, and ridiculed, much in the way that cis women are, while trans men are largely invisible. And you can see a history of this in the documentary that I'm asking you to watch for this section, Disclosure, executive produced by Laverne Cox and directed by Sam Frieder on Netflix. Trans sex and porn industries, catering to straight identified men, they don't fetishize those on the FTM spectrum. No, they objectify trans women because trans women's bodies and persons are female. For someone on the MTF spectrum, this is Serano, I'm not dismissed merely for failing to live up to binary gender norms, but rather for my expressing my own femaleness and my femininity. I don't feel I am the victim of transphobia as much as I am the victim of trans misogyny. So this is the term that she coins, and it's specifically the way that trans women are subjected to misogyny, maybe of the sort that Mann talks about. And it's because of trans women being women. So as an example, in women's spaces, Serano experiences offhand comments about her trans status, which are supposed to be a reminder that she's not a real woman. But she always finds this puzzling because as soon as they all walk out of that door, they would all face very similar discrimination for being women and for being gay. Also, she remarks that these very women would have no problem with women expressing masculinity or with FTM folks. But they did have a problem with her, and she chalks that up to having a problem with femininity and tracing or tracking a society-wide devaluation of femininity in our culture. Now, sometimes it's argued that trans men have more in common with queer women because of their, quote, upbringing as women, whereas trans women have less because of their upbringing as men. And Serano points out that this is odd. How can someone who identifies as female and currently lives as a woman have less in common with women than a male-identified person who has male physical attributes and currently benefits from male privilege? Serano suspects that trans women, the idea that trans women should be singled out because we used to be men, is really highly suspect in this case. Instead, it reflects a society-wide inclination to view masculinity as being strong, so the male-identified person with the male physical attributes, the FTM person being accepted, as being strong and natural, whereas femininity is weak, it's artificial, it's practiced, it's fake, and it's not a good thing. In this article, she also gives some examples of arguments given for exclusion from women-only spaces that track this concept of transmisogyny. So one argument is claiming trans women have some kind of male energy. Well, Serano's point suggests that, well, then you think that men have some abilities and aptitudes that women are not capable of. If you believe in this kind of male energy stuff, that's energy that cannot be exuded by women. Or by claiming that trans women ought to be excluded because they have male genitalia. Well, she points out that this objectifies trans women just by reducing them to their genitalia. Not only that, but it also propagates the myth that men's power and domination arises from the phallus instead of many of the interlocking social and economic and institutions in our society. So when cis women deny trans women the right to participate in such spaces, they privilege any kind of mannish or masculine traits that trans women might have over many of the other female attributes. And she thinks this is an example itself of fostering and promoting male centrism. So we might return to this idea of are trans women excluded because of socialization as men or something like that. And she gives an anecdotal of someone who she talked with about this. And the person was like, yeah, I'm just not comfortable with trans women being in these women-only spaces because of their socialization as men. And she points out, well, what about trans women who were socialized as a woman growing up? And the person's like, yeah, I guess I still am not comfortable. She's like, okay, well, what about someone who was born female but raised as a man against her will, who then finally reclaimed her womanhood? And the person was like, yeah, I think that I would be okay with that because, I think that there's even more that we could be, have in common with, because that seems like a very clear case of an imposition of patriarchy and whatnot. And then Serano's point is like, well, that's really exactly how trans women tend to see their experiences. Someone who is raised a man against her will, who then finally reclaimed her womanhood. The only difference is that they were not assigned female at birth. And maybe the other difference is that trans women might have a penis as opposed to a vagina. But then, this falls right prey to this criticism down here. There's also the idea that trans women offer a threat to women in general. So there's no evidence that trans women are more violent or abusive than women taken as a whole. That seems to be a bugbear. If you also look at the very first, I think it was the second section of this course, where you can look at the feminist case against the feminist case against trans inclusivity, that kind of debunks some of these arguments. So she wants to say, look, the main reason why trans women exclusion evokes such passion and frustration in her is precisely because it is both anti-trans and anti-feminist. As a feminist, it gravely disturbs me that other self-described feminists are so willing to overlook or purposefully ignore how inherently sexist trans women exclusion policies and politics are. They favor trans men over trans women. They rampantly objectify trans female bodies, and they privilege trans women's appearances, socializations, and sex others assigned to us at birth over our persons, our minds, and our identities. And that just sounds very similar to the kind of treatment that cis women have complained about in feminist circles when it comes to sexism and misogyny. And she says, look, I'm sure that a lot of the same people who support Michigan's trans women exclusion policy, or who sit on the fence on this issue, would have a very different opinion if it were their own inclusion that was being debated. Can you imagine how angry these very same women would be if the largest annual women-only event in the world was run by straight women who decided to exclude queer women from attending? Can you imagine how insulted they would feel if they were told that they were not allowed to enter women-only space because they were not real women, or that their attraction to women might threaten the safety of other women? These are, in fact, criticisms that have been levied against cis women lesbians for some time. But set that aside. Can you imagine how condescending they would find it if straight women talked to them about being queer positive 1 minute, and then turned around and purchased a $400 ticket to a queer-free women's event the next? As much as I'm bothered by the long history of trans women being expelled from the lesbian community during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, I'm willing to chalk that up to the fact that the transgender movement hadn't fully come into its own yet, and there were few people who were able to articulate a clear message for transgender rights and inclusion at that time. But now, in 2007, there's no legitimate excuse for trans women exclusion in lesbian and women-only spaces. Most LGBT groups have long since added T's to the end of their acronyms. And while there was a time when trans inclusion debates only took place on the outskirts of the queer community, they now take place in workplaces and courthouses all across the United States. In the last 20 years, 9 states, Minnesota, Rhode Island, etc., and scores of cities and counties across the country have extended their non-discrimination laws to explicitly include transgender people. It's downright embarrassing that so many folks within the queer women's community, who generally pride themselves on their progressive politics, have managed to fall behind Peoria, Illinois, and El Paso, Texas, in recognizing and respecting trans people's gender identities. What saddens me even more than the irrational trans-misogynistic fear and hatred displayed by the vocal minority who most adamantly oppose our inclusion is the apathy of the silent majority of queer women and feminists who enable that prejudice. Those who continue to attend women's events that exclude trans women. Those who excuse or choose not to confront anti-feminist, anti-trans women's comments and actions made by members of their own community. Those who tacitly give credence to anti-feminist, anti-trans women rhetoric by referring to the issue of trans women exclusion as a controversy or a debate. I would submit to them that there has never been a legitimate debate regarding this issue, as the overwhelming majority of dialogues and discourses on this subject have taken place among cis-sexual women in the absence of any trans women. Perhaps the most naive and condescending refrain apologists for the trans women exclusionists make is that those apologists are working hard to change these women-only organizations and spaces from within. But this is a very flawed notion. If you look back at history, there's not been a single instance where people have overcome a deeply entrenched prejudice without first being forced to interact with the people that they detest. Mere words cannot dispel bigoted stereotypes and fears. Only personal experiences can. The queer rights movement would not have made the progress that it has if activists merely relied on queer-positive straight people to lobby on our behalf, to speak as our proxies. Social progress was only made through both the frontline work of outspoken activists shouting, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," and that of committed straight allies who absolutely refused to tolerate anti-queer remarks and discrimination from members of their own communities. Similarly, I entreat all feminists and all queer women to recognize that the divisive issue of trans women exclusion will continue to be with us as long as we fail to directly confront and repudiate anti-feminist, anti-trans women policies and rhetoric wherever they exist. So I will leave you with that discussion of transmisogyny and her call to action.